Hi everyone, this is a video explaining the Milgram experiment, looking at the question of how does genocide continue to happen today. So we're looking look at Stanley Milgram's research. The question that he was looking at are how do normal law-abiding people commit acts of evil? So, what was his research? And as we go through this, I want you to be jotting down some notes, keeping track of some of this information so we can discuss it and work on an activity with this in class tomorrow. So, only a couple decades after the Holocaust, Stanley Milgram, who was a psychologist, he wanted to know a couple things. Why do people obey authority even when they know they're being asked to do something that's wrong? And why do people refuse to confront those that abuse their power? And again, this is based on a lot about his research after the Holocaust, looking at some people's responses and why they decided to go along with the Holocaust, why they participated in it. So, a lot of this research is about obeying authority coming from what he learned about from the Holocaust. So, what was this experiment? Milgram recruited subjects for his experiments from all walks of life. And anyone who responded, they were told that there was an experiment that they're going to study the effects of punishment on learning ability. And they were offered money to participate in the study. Keep in mind, again, this is the 1960s. So, although different respondents thought they had an equal chance of playing both the role of a student and a teacher, because remember it's a learning experiment, the process was rigged. So, all the people who responded ended up playing the role of teacher, and the person who was the learner was actually an actor who was going along with the experiment. Keep that in mind. These teachers were asked to administer different levels of shocks to the learner when questions were answered. So there would be a sequence of learning questions, and each time the student or the actor got them wrong, the teacher was required to give a shock of increasing value. And so at first, they were very low shocks, and then as it went along, they were getting more and more increasing in voltage. And this whole time, remember that the respondents are the teachers, and they don't know that this is fake. So each time they actually feel like they're giving this shock to the students. Shocks range from 15 to 450 volts. There is on the actual box you'll see in the video that I'm going to show you in a moment. You'll see that it clearly is marked by number of how many volts, and with word labels too, like slight shock, moderate shock, etc., all the way up to XXX, which was a obviously death. And so in response to these jolts, the learner or this actor will begin to grunt or complain, ask to be released as these shocks continue to go up in voltage. And so you'll see later on that the learner eventually was yelling loudly. And something that was mentioned at the beginning was that they had a heart condition, but the experimenter continued to tell them, it's okay, don't worry about it, like it's minor shocks, you'll be just fine. And so they were actually measuring how obedient the teacher would be to what degree of shocks could they give before they finally said no, especially with the experimenter in the room telling them, continue, you must continue to go forward. So this is just a slide that just gives you a little more information. Teachers were also instructed to treat silence as an incorrect answer and continue to apply the next shock to the student. If at any point the innocent teacher hesitated, the experimenter would continue to pressure him to proceed. The experiment requires you to continue. You must continue. So the experimenter continued to pressure, continue to force the teacher to become obedient, even as the actor, or again, the student, was pretending to be in pain. So let's watch a video on this now.
In a unique period from the early 60s to the early 70s, a group of social scientists conducted a series of experiments examining the nature of human behavior and its relationship to social conventions and situations.
In this setting, I allow things to be done to me that I wouldn't allow in any other context. The dentist is about to put an electric drill into my mouth. In this setting, I willingly expose my throat to a man with a razor blade.
That's Milgram.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience? These are questions me.
But he might be dead in there. The experiment requires that you continue teaching. 330 volts.
The experiments that Milgram and others conducted were controversial, and for ethical reasons may never be conducted again. Yet the results of those experiments remain groundbreaking, profoundly revealing about the tensions between the individual and society, and increasingly relevant to contemporary life. In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an event that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean, as far as is necessary? The test.
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You had no other choice, did you?
Oh, I had a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's here. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know. Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which was created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts. Please continue, teacher. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. Next.
That's a really big point that I want to make sure you guys understand here is the diffusion of responsibility. Giving up that responsibility is a key component to why people are obedient. Keep that in mind as you continue to watch and as you think about this for tomorrow.
So slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it. Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please. I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything? Whether the learner likes it or not, But he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think, very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch? I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows like how far human beings will go to appease what they perceive to be an authority figure.
So right here at the end, you hear a lot of these students talking about that they feel that if this were done again today, what kind of response would there be? And so, as you can clearly see, there's a lot of ethical issues going on in this experiment of can this actually be conducted again today? Well, we're going to find out tomorrow. What would it actually look like if people were to do this again? Do you think they'd actually be obedient? Or do you think they would be able to stand up and admit what they're doing is wrong? So be sure you're filling in your notes. Make sure you have everything down. Be sure to fill out that Google form if you have any questions so we can address them tomorrow. And have a good evening. I will see you tomorrow.